The smallest act of kindness can change your life forever. Rain hammered against the glass roof of Union Station in downtown Chicago as commuters rushed past without slowing down. Most people kept their heads down, focused on getting home before the storm grew worse. Emily Johnson was one of them. At 24 years old, she had spent the entire day juggling responsibilities that never seemed to end. Her shift at the diner had run late. Her rent was overdue. And tomorrow morning she had the most important job interview of her life. If she did not get hired, she honestly did not know what she would do next. Emily checked her wallet for the third time that evening. $10. That was all she had left until her next paycheck. Just one crumpled $10 bill. She sighed and slipped it back into her wallet. The money was supposed to buy breakfast before her interview. It was not much, but right now it mattered. The station was crowded despite the weather. People hurried across the polished floor carrying umbrellas, coffee cups, and briefcases. Nobody seemed interested in anything beyond their own problems. Then Emily noticed him. A man sat alone near a concrete pillar at the far end of the station. His clothes were worn. His dark coat looked soaked from the rain. A small duffel bag rested beside him. Unlike the others moving through the station, he sat completely still, quietly observing the crowd. Most people walked past without looking at him. Some deliberately avoided eye contact. Emily slowed her pace. Something about him felt different. It was not pity that stopped her. It was his expression. Despite his circumstances, there was a calm dignity in the way he carried himself. He did not ask anyone for money. He did not call for help. He simply sat there as though he had accepted being invisible. Emily continued walking for several feet before stopping. She glanced at her wallet again. $10. Her last $10. Logic told her to keep moving. She needed that money. Tomorrow mattered. Her future mattered. Yet her feet refused to cooperate. Before she could change her mind, she turned around and walked back toward the stranger. The man looked up as she approached. His blue eyes reflected surprise. Emily pulled the $10 bill from her wallet and held it out. "I know it is not much," she said softly. "But maybe it can help." For a moment, the man simply stared at the money. Then he looked at her face as if trying to understand why she was doing this. "Miss," he said carefully, "this might be all you have." Emily laughed quietly. "You noticed that?" The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I notice more than people think." Emily placed the bill in his hand anyway. "Then you probably noticed you need it more than I do." The man looked down at the money. Something unreadable crossed his expression. Gratitude. Surprise. Maybe even admiration. Finally he nodded. "Thank you." Emily smiled. "Good luck." She turned and walked away before he could say anything else. What she did not see was the way the stranger continued watching her disappear into the crowd. What she did not know was that his name was David Carter. And what she could not possibly imagine was that less than 24 hours later, the same man sitting alone in that train station would completely change the course of her life. Emily barely slept that night. The rain had followed her all the way home, and the image of the stranger at the train station remained fixed in her mind. Not because she regretted giving away her last $10, but because of the look in his eyes when she did it. There had been something unusual about him. Something impossible to explain. By 6 o'clock the next morning, she was already awake, standing in front of a cracked bathroom mirror inside her small apartment. She carefully adjusted her blouse and reviewed answers to interview questions she had practiced for weeks. This opportunity mattered. A position at Nova's Park Foundation could finally give her stability. More importantly, it could help her support her mother, whose medical expenses seemed to increase every month. Emily checked her bank account before leaving. The balance was painfully low. The $10 she had given away would have made breakfast possible. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of water and headed out the door. Downtown Chicago looked completely different in the morning sunlight. Glass skyscrapers reflected the bright sky as professionals hurried toward offices and meetings. Emily felt out of place among them, but she kept walking. 40 minutes later she arrived outside Nova's Park Tower. The building seemed impossibly tall. Its polished exterior gleamed against the skyline like a monument to success. Emily took a deep breath and entered. The lobby alone was larger than the diner where she worked. Marble floors stretched beneath enormous chandeliers. Employees moved confidently through security gates while digital displays showcased charitable projects funded by the foundation. Emily signed in and was directed to the 32nd floor. Her nerves grew worse with every passing second. When the elevator doors finally opened, she stepped into a sleek reception area where several candidates were already waiting. Everyone looked polished and confident. Emily quietly took a seat and tried not to panic. 20 minutes later a receptionist appeared. "Miss Johnson, they are ready for you." Emily stood and followed her down a hallway lined with glass offices. Her heartbeat accelerated as they approached the conference room. This was it. The opportunity she desperately needed. The receptionist opened the door. Emily stepped inside and immediately froze. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. At the far end of the conference table sat the man from the train station. The same blue eyes. The same face. Only now he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit worth more than Emily's monthly rent. Around him sat executives, department directors, and foundation leaders. Nobody looked surprised except her. The room fell silent. Emily stood motionless near the doorway. For several seconds she could not speak. The stranger looked up from a file and met her gaze. Then something remarkable happened. A faint smile appeared on his face. Not a mocking smile. Not an amused smile. A grateful one. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he said calmly. "Please have a seat." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "You?" The word escaped before she could stop it. Several executives exchanged confused looks. The man leaned back in his chair. "My name is David Carter," he said. "And I have been looking forward to seeing you again." Emily could barely focus on the interview after hearing the name David Carter. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Chicago did. David Carter was not only the founder of Nova's Park Foundation but also the billionaire chief executive officer behind one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. The article she had read about him described a brilliant businessman, a visionary leader, and one of the most influential philanthropists in America. None of those articles had mentioned that he occasionally spent rainy nights sitting alone in train stations dressed like a man who had nowhere to go. Emily slowly lowered herself into a chair, still trying to understand what was happening. The executives around the table began asking questions about her work experience, volunteer history, and career goals. She answered as professionally as possible, but every few minutes she found herself glancing toward David. He listened carefully to every response, occasionally making notes, never interrupting. Yet there was something different about the way he looked at her compared to the other candidates. It was not favoritism. It was curiosity. Almost as if he was trying to understand who she really was. Nearly an hour later, the interview finally ended. Emily thanked everyone and stood to leave. Before she reached the door, David spoke. "Miss Johnson, would you mind staying for a few minutes?" The room immediately grew quiet. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Once everyone else left, the massive conference room suddenly felt much larger. David remained seated at the far end of the table while sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. For a moment neither spoke. Finally Emily broke the silence. "You were not homeless." David smiled faintly. "No." "Then why were you there?" David folded his hands. "Because sometimes the easiest way to learn about people is when they think nobody important is watching." Emily frowned. "You test strangers." "Not exactly." He leaned back slightly. Several times each year, I spend a few days visiting places our foundation supports. Shelters, community centers, public transportation hubs. I prefer seeing reality without cameras and publicity. Emily considered that. It sounded unusual, but somehow believable. David continued. Yesterday dozens of people walked past me. His eyes met hers. You were the only one who stopped. Emily looked down. It was only $10. David shook his head. No. It was your last $10. The fact that he knew that startled her. Before she could respond, David opened a folder resting on the table. Do you know why I asked you to stay? Emily slowly shook her head. David slid the folder across the table. Inside was an employment offer. Not an interview invitation. Not a second interview. An actual offer. Emily stared at the page in disbelief. The salary alone was higher than she had ever imagined earning. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the details. Community Outreach Coordinator. Full benefits. Growth opportunities. Meaningful work. Everything she had hoped for and more. There must be a mistake, she whispered. David's expression softened. There is no mistake. Emily looked up. Why me? David smiled. Because skills can be taught. Character cannot. For the second time in less than 24 hours, Emily found herself speechless. And deep inside, she had the strange feeling that accepting this offer would be the beginning of something far bigger than a new job. Emily spent the entire train ride home staring at the employment offer. Even after reading it 5 times, she could not convince herself it was real. The salary alone would change everything. She could pay her rent on time. She could help her mother without constantly worrying about medical bills. For the first time in years, the future felt like something other than a series of problems waiting to happen. Yet one question refused to leave her mind. Why had David Carter chosen her? The next morning, Emily arrived at Nova's Park Foundation nearly an hour early. She wanted to make a good impression. The lobby looked just as intimidating as it had the day before, but this time she was not a visitor. She was an employee. A receptionist handed her an identification badge and directed her toward the Community Outreach Department. As Emily stepped into the open office space, conversation slowed. Several employees looked up from their desks. Some smiled politely. Others seemed curious. A few simply stared. Emily tried not to overthink it. New employees always attracted attention. By lunchtime, however, she realized something felt different. 2 co-workers sitting nearby lowered their voices whenever she walked past. Another employee glanced at her badge and raised an eyebrow. During a team meeting, a woman named Lauren barely acknowledged her presence. Emily could not understand the tension. She had been there less than 4 hours. What could she possibly have done wrong already? Later that afternoon, she finally got her answer. While organizing outreach files in a storage room, she overheard voices coming from the hallway outside. I heard David personally hired her. No interview process. Apparently not. Must be nice. Emily froze. Her stomach sank. The rumors had already started. She quietly returned to her desk and focused on her work, pretending she had not heard anything. Across the building, David sat inside his office reviewing reports. Through the glass walls, he noticed Emily working long after several employees had stopped paying attention. He also noticed the whispers. The curious looks. The assumptions. None of it surprised him. Successful organizations often struggled with the same weakness as individuals. People filled information gaps with stories. Unfortunately, those stories were rarely kind. Near the end of the day, Emily received an email inviting her to attend a community outreach event the following evening. The foundation regularly partnered with local shelters and food programs throughout the city. Emily immediately volunteered to help. If she was going to prove herself, she intended to earn every bit of trust placed in her. The next evening, she arrived at a neighborhood soup kitchen on the west side of Chicago. The atmosphere was warm despite the cold weather outside. Volunteers moved between tables serving meals while families and elderly residents gathered together. Emily quickly joined the effort. She greeted guests, carried trays, and listened to stories from people facing difficult circumstances. It reminded her of home. It reminded her of her mother. Most importantly, it reminded her why helping others mattered. As she carried a basket of bread toward one of the tables, an elderly woman with silver hair smiled at her warmly. "You have kind eyes," the woman said. Emily laughed softly. "Thank you." The woman nodded toward an empty seat beside her. "Sit for a moment. I think we should talk." Emily had no idea that this simple conversation would introduce her to someone who would soon become one of the most important people in her life. Emily hesitated before taking the seat beside the elderly woman. There was something comforting about her presence, something that reminded her of the way her own mother spoke when she wanted someone to feel seen and understood. The woman introduced herself as Ruth Parker and accepted a cup of tea from a volunteer before turning her attention back to Emily. "You are new here," Ruth observed. Emily nodded. "First week with the foundation." Ruth smiled knowingly. "And already carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Emily laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who have done the same thing." For the next 20 minutes, they talked while the soup kitchen buzzed around them. Emily shared stories about working long shifts at the diner, worrying about bills, and trying to help her mother. Ruth listened carefully without interrupting. When Emily finished, Ruth simply nodded. Kindness has a way of finding its way back. Emily immediately thought about the train station but said nothing. Before she could ask another question, a familiar voice appeared behind her. "Mrs. Parker, I was hoping to find you here." Emily turned and nearly dropped the stack of paper plates she was holding. David Carter stood only a few feet away. Unlike the interview, he was dressed casually in dark jeans and a simple jacket. For a brief moment, he looked more like the man from the train station than the billionaire executive from the office tower. Ruth smiled warmly. "David." Emily looked back and forth between them. "You know each other?" Ruth laughed. "I knew him long before he became famous." David pulled out a chair and joined them. Mrs. Parker was one of the first people to support our outreach programs. Emily suddenly felt self-conscious. The room seemed smaller with David sitting beside her. Yet what surprised her most was how comfortable he appeared. Staff members greeted him casually. Volunteers asked questions. Families thanked him. He spoke to everyone with genuine attention. There was no entourage. No publicity team. No cameras. Just a man quietly helping. As the evening continued, Emily watched him interact with people who had fallen on difficult times. He remembered names. He asked about children and grandparents. He listened more than he talked. The image she had formed of billionaires throughout her life began to crack. Eventually the crowd started thinning out. Volunteers cleaned tables while guests prepared to leave. Emily helped stack chairs near the entrance when David approached. "How was your first outreach event?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she admitted. David smiled. "That is usually how it starts." Emily hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering her all day. "Why do you spend so much time doing this yourself?" David looked around the room. "Because numbers on reports do not tell the whole story." He paused. "People do." For a moment neither spoke. Then David reached into his jacket pocket and removed something small. Emily immediately recognized it. A folded $10 bill protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. Her eyes widened. "You kept it?" David nodded. "Some gifts are worth more than their value." Emily stared at the bill in disbelief. The room suddenly felt very quiet. And for the first time since meeting him, she realized that the night at the train station might have meant as much to David as it had unknowingly come to mean to her. Emily could not stop thinking about the protected $10 bill. Long after the outreach event ended and she returned home, the image remained in her mind. It was not the money itself that mattered. It was the fact that David had preserved it so carefully. For someone who managed companies worth billions of dollars, the gesture felt strangely personal. The next morning, Emily arrived at the office carrying a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since joining the foundation, she felt like she truly belonged there. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that opinion. As the days passed, the whispers around the office grew louder. Some employees questioned why David seemed to trust her so quickly. Others assumed she had received special treatment. Emily tried to ignore it and focus on her work, but the tension became harder to avoid. One afternoon, during a planning meeting for a new community initiative, a senior coordinator named Lauren openly challenged her ideas. "That approach sounds optimistic," Lauren said with a forced smile. "But outreach programs require experience, not good intentions." Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. Emily felt her face warm, but she refused to back down. "Experience matters," she replied calmly. "But understanding the people we serve matters too." The room fell quiet. To Emily's surprise, David spoke before anyone else could respond. "Miss Johnson makes a valid point." Every head turned toward him. David continued reviewing the proposal as though nothing unusual had happened. "The purpose of outreach is connecting with people. We should never lose sight of that." The discussion moved on, but Emily noticed Lauren's expression harden. The support felt encouraging, yet it also drew more attention to her. Later that evening, Emily stayed late to finish reports. Most employees had already gone home when David appeared near her desk carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said. Emily smiled. "You have a habit of surprising people." David laughed softly and handed her the cup. For a few minutes they worked in comfortable silence while the city lights illuminated the office through the enormous windows. Finally, Emily asked the question she had been avoiding. "Do you ever regret it?" David looked up from his tablet. "Regret what?" "Being wealthy." The question caught him off guard. He leaned back and considered it carefully. "No," he said honestly. "But I regret how often people confuse wealth with value." Emily nodded slowly. "I think I understand that now." David studied her for a moment. Most people spend years learning that lesson. Their conversation was interrupted when David's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time Emily noticed genuine concern cross his face. "Everything okay?" she asked. David hesitated. "There is a funding issue involving one of our largest community projects." Emily immediately sat forward. "Can I help?" David looked surprised. Then he smiled. "That is exactly why I hired you." As they began reviewing documents together, neither realized that this challenge would become the first real test of their partnership and the beginning of a bond far stronger than either of them expected. The following week at Nova's Park Foundation was a whirlwind for Emily. She arrived early every day, determined to prove herself, yet the tension among the staff never fully disappeared. Some employees continued to whisper, speculating about why David had trusted her so quickly. Lauren, the senior coordinator who had challenged her ideas before, now watched her with a critical eye during every meeting. Emily focused on the community project at hand, a mobile food outreach program designed to reach neighborhoods that often went unnoticed. She spent hours planning routes, organizing volunteers, and coordinating with local suppliers. Each decision mattered, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her. David observed her progress from his office across the hall, occasionally stopping by to offer guidance without overshadowing her. One afternoon, as Emily reviewed volunteer schedules, a delivery truck pulled up outside, causing a minor logistical issue with storage space. The volunteers scrambled, and Emily realized that if she did not act quickly, valuable supplies might be wasted. She immediately coordinated a temporary arrangement, directing volunteers to use an unused hall and marking the items for distribution. Her quick thinking impressed the volunteers, and even Lauren raised an eyebrow in recognition. Later, David joined Emily in the hall to check on the project's progress. "You handled that very well," he said calmly, offering her a reassuring smile. Emily felt a small surge of pride. "Thank you. I just wanted to make sure nothing went wrong." "That is exactly why I hired you," David replied, his voice steady. They continued to walk through the halls together, reviewing reports and discussing upcoming outreach events. For the first time, Emily felt like she belonged, like she was making a tangible difference rather than just trying to survive each day. By evening, most volunteers had left, and Emily and David remained to organize the next day's schedule. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the faint murmur of city traffic outside the large windows. Emily glanced at David. "Do you ever get tired of doing everything yourself?" she asked softly. He paused, considering the question, then shook his head. "Not when I see someone who is willing to learn and contribute. That makes the effort worthwhile." Emily smiled faintly. "I am still learning." "And you are already doing better than most," David said, nodding toward the organized schedules and neatly labeled materials. They moved toward the elevator together, the tall glass walls reflecting the glow of streetlights. For a brief moment, their hands brushed as Emily held the folders she had been carrying. Neither spoke, but the simple contact brought a quiet sense of connection. As the doors closed, Emily realized that beyond the whispers and doubts, a partnership was forming. It was not just about the foundation or the outreach programs. It was about trust, shared purpose, and the slow, growing bond between two people who had unexpectedly crossed paths and discovered that kindness and competence could lead to something far greater than either had imagined. The following evening, Emily arrived early at the Nova's Park Foundation for the next outreach event, her nerves mingling with excitement. The project involved distributing care packages to several low-income neighborhoods across the city, and the team had meticulously planned routes and schedules. Emily immediately began organizing volunteers, assigning tasks, and ensuring that supplies were prepared and accounted for. David arrived shortly after, dressed casually but with the same calm authority that made people naturally follow his lead. As they loaded the vans, Emily noticed that several employees still exchanged skeptical glances, whispering quietly about her rapid rise and perceived favoritism. She ignored them, focusing on the tasks at hand. Throughout the day, the team encountered unexpected challenges, blocked streets, delayed deliveries, and volunteers who had never worked in logistics before. Emily remained composed, issuing clear instructions and keeping morale high, while David observed from the lead van, offering guidance only when necessary, allowing her to demonstrate her initiative and problem-solving skills. At one point, a delivery for a local community center was accidentally sent to the wrong location. Emily quickly coordinated a reroute, contacting the driver, and personally delivered the missing supplies, earning the respect and quiet admiration of the volunteers. As the sun began to set, they returned to the foundation with all items delivered successfully. The exhausted but satisfied team gathered in the lobby, and for the first time, Emily felt a deep sense of accomplishment and belonging. David approached her with a faint smile. "You handled everything remarkably today," he said softly, offering a small nod of approval. Emily smiled in return, feeling a warmth in her chest that was more than professional pride. "It was challenging, but rewarding," she replied. "I could not have done it without your guidance." David shook his head. "You did more than follow guidance. You made decisions, adapted to the situation, and inspired others to do the same." They walked through the quiet office together, the ambient lights reflecting softly off the polished floors. Emily glanced at him, curiosity and admiration mixing with a subtle tension she could not yet name. "Do you ever get tired of managing all of this?" she asked cautiously. David looked thoughtful. "Not when I see someone who can handle responsibility and care about the people we serve. That is what makes the work meaningful." Emily nodded, understanding in a way she never had before that this partnership was not just about business or charity, but a shared purpose. As they reached the exit, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky. They paused, briefly standing side by side, the energy between them quiet but undeniable. In that moment, Emily realized that the foundation, the volunteers, and the outreach were no longer simply tasks to complete. They had become a space where trust, respect, and something far more personal could grow, setting the stage for a connection neither of them fully understood yet but both could feel deep in their hearts. For a while, Emily allowed herself to believe that the difficult part was finally behind her. The outreach program continued growing, volunteer participation increased, and several neighborhoods that had previously received little support were now benefiting from regular assistance. Even some of the employees who had doubted her in the beginning had started treating her differently. Respect was replacing skepticism. Unfortunately, not everyone was happy about the change. One Monday morning, Emily arrived at the office and immediately sensed something was wrong. Conversation stopped when she walked by. A few co-workers avoided eye contact altogether. Others glanced at her with expressions she could not quite understand. Confusion slowly turned into concern. By lunchtime, she discovered the reason. An anonymous post had appeared on a popular business forum late the night before. It claimed that Emily had only been hired because of a personal relationship with David Carter. The post suggested that her promotions, responsibilities, and growing influence within the foundation had nothing to do with talent or hard work. There was no evidence attached. No facts. Just rumors. Yet within hours, the story had spread across social media and professional networks. Emily sat frozen at her desk staring at the screen. Her stomach tightened with every comment she read. Some people questioned her qualifications. Others accused her of manipulating opportunities. A few even suggested that all of her accomplishments were undeserved. It felt like watching months of effort disappear beneath a wave of assumptions. Across the building, David was dealing with the same situation. Several board members had already contacted him requesting explanations. A public relations advisor recommended releasing a statement. Another suggested quietly moving Emily to a less visible role. David rejected both ideas immediately. Late that afternoon, Emily gathered her things and prepared to leave. For the first time since joining the foundation, she felt exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. As she stepped into the elevator, the doors opened again before they could close. David entered and stood beside her. Neither spoke during the ride down. When the elevator reached the lobby, David finally broke the silence. "Walk with me." Outside, the city was wrapped in the soft light of early evening. They crossed the street and entered a small public park overlooking the river. People passed by carrying coffee cups and walking dogs, completely unaware of the storm unfolding inside Emily's mind. "I am sorry," she said quietly. David stopped walking. "For what?" Emily looked away. "Because this is causing problems for you." David stared at her in disbelief. "Emily, none of this is your fault." "Maybe not. But people believe it." David shook his head firmly. "People believed I was homeless too." The unexpected answer made her laugh despite herself. David smiled. The truth does not change just because rumors are louder. For several moments, neither spoke. Then David reached into his wallet and carefully removed the protected $10 bill. He held it up between them. "Do you know why I keep this?" Emily looked at the familiar bill. "Because it reminds you of kindness." David nodded. "And because it reminds me that character reveals itself when nobody expects a reward." His eyes met hers. "I know exactly who you are, Emily. That is not going to change because of an anonymous post on the internet." For the first time all day, the weight pressing against her chest began to lift. She realized she was no longer facing the situation alone. And somewhere deep inside, she began to understand that David's faith in her meant far more than she had ever allowed herself to admit.